In this lesson, you will learn to determine the nature of the roots of a quadratic equation by using what is called the discriminant. Now the question begins with, what is the discriminant? Well, the discriminant is based off the quadratic formula. So in the quadratic formula, it is the portion inside of the radical right here, b squared minus 4ac. So that would be your discriminant. And now what the discriminant does is it tells us different things about the type of solutions we're going to get. So, for example, if the discriminant is greater than 0, so looking at the quadratic equation or quadratic formula, if the part inside of the radical right here were greater than 0, let's say a 5. So in this specific case, if the discriminant is 5, then our first question is going to be, how many roots will it have? Now this word roots simply means solutions. So how many solutions will this have? Well, notice we have a plus or a minus square root of 5. So because we have a positive or a negative solution, that would leave me with 2. One is positive, one is negative. So we have 2 roots or 2 solutions to this problem. Next question that you need to be able to answer is, do we have a real or imaginary solution? Remember, imaginary is when you have the square root of a negative number. Otherwise, everything else is going to be real. So in this case, it's not the square root of a negative number, so therefore it's going to be a real solution. And then the last question is, if it's real, will it be rational or irrational? Remember, irrational numbers are numbers that do not, you cannot take the square root evenly. So here, the square root of 5, that does not come out to be a nice round solution, right? The square root of 4 would just be 2. Square root of 5 would be 2 point something that goes on forever. So because the decimal answer keeps going forever, it's not a perfect square, that is considered irrational. Whereas rational would be the ones that are perfect squares. Okay, now what if it was greater than 0, but the discriminant, let's say, is a 16 instead? So right here, your discriminant is 16. Well, the first question is, how many roots? Well, once again, we have a positive or negative square root, which would leave me with 2 roots. And then real or imaginary, well, it's still a positive number. It's not the square root of a negative number, so this still would be real. And the next question is, if it's real, will it be rational or irrational? Now in this case, the square root of 16 is a perfect square, so this would be a rational solution. Okay, now what if the discriminant is less than 0? So for example, the discriminant was a negative 3. So first question is, how many roots does it have? How many solutions? Well, it's going to be a positive or negative square root of negative 3, which leaves me with 2 solutions. The next question is, will it be real or imaginary? Well, we have a square root of a negative number, so therefore, this would be an imaginary solution. And then if it's real, would it be rational or irrational? Well, it's not real, it's imaginary. So therefore, it's neither. It's not rational or irrational, because under real numbers, we have rational and irrational are categories of real numbers, but over here we have the whole category of imaginary numbers, which are a total separate entity. So because it's imaginary, it cannot be real, it cannot be rational or irrational. Next question is, what if the discriminant is equal to 0? Well, if it's equal to 0, then the discriminant right here, and the radical would be 0. And first question is, how many roots? Well, notice we have a plus or minus square root of 0. What is the square root of 0? Well, it's just going to be 0, right? So we're adding 0 or subtracting 0. Notice that'd be the same thing. If you add nothing or take away nothing, that's saying the same thing. So even though there's a plus or minus there, we really only have one solution. So there's only one root in this case. Next question is, will it be real or imaginary? Well, imaginary is only square root of negative numbers. 0 is not a negative number, so therefore it must be a real solution. And 0 is a real number. Square root of a 0 is 0. 0 is real. It's not imaginary. And next question is, if it's real, is it rational or irrational? Well, rational would be the perfect squares. And notice here, we said the square root of 0 would just be 0. Because 0 squared equals 0. 1 squared equals 1, etc. 0 squared is 0, so the square root of 0 would be a perfect square. So therefore, it's going to be rational, not irrational. So here the discriminant is given to you, whether it be 0 or 5 or 16 or whatever. Now you're given an equation and you have to find or determine what is the discriminant and then answer those same questions. So really the same thing, except you have to do the extra step of finding the discriminant for yourself. So if it says find the discriminant, what you need to do is you need to plug this in to that part of the quadratic formula, the b squared minus 4ac. So you just plug in the different numbers into that discriminant formula. And so here we have a is equal to 1, b would be negative 4, c would be negative 5. So instead of b squared, we have negative 4 squared. And instead of 4ac, we have 4 times 1 times negative 5. Negative 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 1 times the negative 5 would be a positive 20. You add those together to get 36. So then we know the discriminant is equal to that. And now from here we need to find the roots. What kind of roots does it have? So how many roots? Well, remember this is, in the scheme of things, notice x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of, and then b squared minus 4ac. This right here is 36. So we have x equals opposite of b plus or minus square root of 36 all over 2a. So here, 36, your discriminant is 36. How many roots does it have? Well, it's going to be 2 because we have positive or negative, so 2 roots. And then real or imaginary? Well, it's a positive number, so the square root of a positive number is going to be real. And the next question is, will it be rational or irrational? Well, the square root of 36 is a perfect square, so that's going to be rational. So we found the discriminant and we can describe the roots from that. Here's one last example. We're given 5t squared minus 4t plus 3 equals 0, and we're told to describe the roots. So first thing is we need to find the discriminant. So the discriminant is found by plugging in a, b, and c into this part of the quadratic formula. So if a would be 5, b would be negative 4, and then c would be 3. So plug those in. Instead of b squared, we have negative 4 squared. Instead of 4 times a times c, we have negative 4 times 5 times 3. Negative 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 5 times 3 would be negative 60. So my discriminant is negative 44. Now remember, inside of the quadratic formula, this would be the square root of negative 44. And so to answer the question on how many roots, by the way, plus or minus the square root, we're going to have 2 roots because of the plus or minus. Is it real or imaginary? Well, it's the square root of a negative number, so it's going to be imaginary. And then rational or irrational, well, that's not applicable because if it's imaginary, it cannot be rational or irrational. So make sure you know how to find the discriminant. Make sure that by the end of this lesson you can describe the roots for a quadratic equation. And that concludes our lesson for today. We will see you next time.